Good morning, students, or good afternoon, students, or wherever you are, whenever you are watching this. This is Professor Dominic, and I'm here with our final chapter of African American art history. And this actually goes beyond what is in your book. This is not the 1990s to the present, and I've actually added some material to this because your book actually ends in the early 1990s. So chapter 5 is called Fin de Siecle Blues. What does fin de siecle mean? Well, it's a French term, and it means end of a cycle or end of the century. And generally, people would use it to mean the end of the 19th century, and they would use it when they were referring to art movements like Art Deco and Art Nouveau and things like that. And now we're moving into the 20th century. We've moved it, or the 21st century, and we've moved past all the things of the 1990s, and we're kind of in a post-postmodern period and what is often referred to as a post-Black period. So let's talk about all that. So unlike the European artistic dominance of the early 20th century, the late 1990s and the early years of the 21st century were full of a Black cultural consciousness that was especially strong in the visual arts. Previously, it had been a disadvantage for one's art to be too closely associated with Black cultural concerns, but in the late 1990s, it was even acceptable, even fashionable to be a Black artist or to interrogate Black identity in one's work. So what does that mean? Let's look at it. And here you can see a guy on a horse charging, and this is very postmodern actually. We're going to get into this artist a little bit later. This is Kehinde Wiley, and Kehinde Wiley is an artist who is in his 50s. He's close to my age actually, and he's an artist who wants to bring Black people into the discussion of art history. And so what he started out by doing is looking at art historical works, such as this was taken after a picture of Napoleon, a white man on his charger in front of the Alps as Napoleon was trying to conquer Europe. And so what Kehinde Wiley has done is obviously he's taken a Black person and put him on the charger. And that's kind of the way in which Kehinde Wiley is literally bringing Black people into the art history discourse. So we'll look at him a little bit later. But this is kind of the thing that we are looking at. So we're trying to, and sometimes artists are turning away from racial identity and cultural difference. Some people are interested in subverting that or sabotaging it. Anything post-colonial complacency, as it says, political correctness, or a celebration of civil rights. These artists subverted the B word, Black, and like the generation before them, experienced critical and financial success through their artistic advocacy of questionable racial and cultural identity. So let's look at some of these artists. So we have an essay by Paul Gilroy, who's actually a sociologist. And if you remember from the last chapter in Postmodern Discourse, it's not unusual for sociologists and anthropologists and ethnographers and whatnot to make commentary on art history. So he wrote a book called Against Race, Imagining Political Culture Beyond the Color Line, and that was written as a critique of racism and fascism, but a lot of his complaint was against perpetrators of racist and fascist acts, past and present, who more or less are operating under things, under the designs of an Afrocentric or Black cause. So for him, no amount of racial and cultural redress for past injustices justified Black supremacism, especially when this implied segregation resounded with overwhelmingly misogynist and racial myth-making tendencies, like you might see in the work of some hip-hop artists who were very misogynist. So he's trying to critique Black culture actually without how can I say this? Without prejudice, without being overly sensitive to how people might feel about Black culture. He's trying to just look at it from a fact-based sort of thing, if that makes sense. So, an artist who might really be pushing that boundary of conceptual limitations of Black art is Kara Walker, and she remains so. If you remember, all the way back in chapter 1, we looked at the work of Moses Williams, who was a silhouette artist. And so, Kara Walker is a young artist who began while she was actually an undergraduate, no, I'm sorry, an MFA student at RISD in the early 1990s. She started doing Black paper silhouettes, and they would have started out, in the 19th century and the 18th century. These were things that were very sentimental, they were very genteel, they were ladylike. Her work is unapologetically not any of those things. In fact, when you first look at them, you might think, oh, how pretty. But then when you look closer into them, you actually see, as it says in our slide here, horrific acts of sexual assault and violence. She's capturing antebellum Southern melodrama in these silhouettes. So, yeah, this one is actually a large-scale print, African American, from 1998. So when they're not tied to this master-slave narrative, she's really very meticulously documenting in her silhouettes things like hairstyles and costumes and physical characteristics. So it's incredible work, but it's also, as it says, incendiary, because it's very raw, and it's very real. And she began to mount them onto white gallery walls, as you see here. Sometimes she uses a screen projector and she projects the silhouettes onto white walls, and there's all kinds of things that you can see here if you take a moment and really look at it. There's fetishism, slavery, death, interracial violence, biological and sexual depravity, and it's all within this context of what originally was a very sweet and, as I said, genteel kind of quote-unquote Victorian clip art. And the way that she's done it is you can't really censor these in an easy way. So they're meant to challenge cultural memory, to challenge high art sensibilities, and also the viewer's sense of decorum, because the images are so shocking in a lot of ways. And then we have another artist, David Leventhal, who produced a series of photographs in the mid-1990s, looked at kind of the underside of race, looking at, things like blackface and Black stereotypes, and things like, the exaggerated features, as you see here in this photograph that he did of what looks to be a cookie jar. And here's an Aunt Jemima or Mammy figure. So he would take these photographs that he would light dramatically, as you can see in the slide, and they're very, racist, mass-produced objects, and kind of putting them up against black velvet and turning them in, by photographing them in this way, into museum-like treasures. And here we have Michael Ray Charles. Here he takes postcards, things like postcards that document lynchings and so forth, and he blows them up very large and then exhibits and publishes them. And again, this all kind of blurs historical boundaries between evidence of racism and what is a desirable art object. Very disturbing. So this is a name that you should know. Her name is Thelma Golden, and she's a very important curator because she curates at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and she's very interested in showcasing African American artists. And so I recommend that you study her and look her up and see some of the things that she's done, because she looks at African American art from a variety of different perspectives and all different styles and so forth. So the next artist we're going to look at is another photographer, Renee Cox, and she uses herself as her canvas, if you will. She photographs herself in a way that examines sexual and gender-informed stereotypes. And then she blows up these photos very, very large. Sometimes she manipulates them digitally. Sometimes she wears prosthetics and things, as we'll see. So this is called Yo Mama from 1993. And they do look so it says it's her approach to self-portraiture makes her photographs ironic rather than exploitative. So here she's looking at, if you've taken some other classes on African American history, you might have heard of the Hottentot Venus. The Hottentot, so-called Hottentot Venus, was a woman named Saartjie Baartman, who was an African woman who, it was really awful. She was very much sexualized and objectified by white people because of the proportions or supposed proportions of her buttocks and her breast. And she was treated as a sideshow commodity during her life. And so Renee Cox created her own prostheses, butt prostheses and breast prostheses, to approximate those of Saartjie Baartman, and then took photographs of herself. So you've got both photography and performance art here. Performance art is definitely a big part of postmodernism. Performance art came out of art. It's not theater in that theater actually arose out of ancient ritual, and performance art is visual artists who are using themselves basically as the canvas, as you see Renee Cox doing. So she's performing with her own body, making commentary about female bodies and, you know, what people see in cliches of particularly Black female bodies. And then she did a Rage superhero series where she basically took photos of herself as an Afrocentric Wonder Woman and an Afrocentric Wonder Woman Avenger. And so from the series we have the liberation. Once again, Aunt Jemima gets liberated. So the liberation of Lady J and UB, or Uncle Ben, as you can see here, where she is striding off of these product boxes with Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima, now transformed and, you know, turned into superheroes themselves, and there's, you know, walking out of the backgrounds. So so as it says in the slide, she's commenting on the thin line between stereotypic characterizations and idealized depictions. There she is, busting the Sphinx in the nose. And then Huey Freeman, some of y'all might know the Boondocks, and Huey Freeman is the wisecracking main character from that. And here in this particular comic frame, he's looking at the character of Storm from the X-Men, who is supposed to be Black. And of course, if you've seen any recent X-Men movies, she actually is Black, whereas previously she may have been in the comics particularly more light-skinned. And what is interesting about Magruder is he's usually using the very popular Japanese anime style or manga style with his own graphic shorthand and making very biting commentaries on mass media. And then we looked at Adrian Piper in chapter 4, and I'm including this picture again because she's using herself in this portrait, self-portrait, as something to make commentary. She's of mixed race, and this portrait is literally called Self-Portrait Exaggerating My Negroid Features. And so she's often trying to confront people and make them look at their own racism and so forth. And I'm going to actually, let's see, I don't want to talk forever. We're going to come back actually to Barbara Chase Riboud. And she divorced the guy that gave her her last name in 1980, but she still, I think, goes by his name because she's known by it. And she created a sculpture called All That Rises Must Converge. And it's actually a huge adaptation of the Malcolm X archetype. And it's nearly 10 feet in height. And then she came to take on a much larger public commission, Africa Rising, which is this here. And it reminds me a bit of Melvin Edwards' Ogun Gate when you look at it there. And it also reminds me a bit of some of the Italian futurists in this figure here as well. But in any case, this actually appears in the federal office building at 290 Broadway. And it's also sharing that space with the New Ring Shout. If you also remember back in the early part of the first chapter, we talked a little bit about the gravesite of Lower Manhattan's 18th century African population, and this is where this federal building happens to be. And so they've done this art installation there to commemorate those people and not just say throw up a building over it. So we've got Barbara Chase Rabu's Africa Rising, and then we've also got right nearby the New Ring Shout. And it's a direct commemoration of the 18th century African burial ground. And what's interesting, the design of the work, you can Google this if you want to, just Google New Ring Shout African burial ground, and you can see the diagram up close and what it is. It's meant to show both the cosmology of Western and Central Africa religions. That's kind of what that quartered circle is, with circles in each area. And then it has, as you can read, probably around the edges of the circle, there are different African tribe names going all the way around. So people that, were taken into the New World. And there's a variety of interesting things there. So I suggest you look it up for greater observation. And then here is another sculpture that was done that by an artist named Lind. I was not smart enough to get the artist's full name. That's great. But it's called America's Song. It's a relief sculpture. As you can see, it's a very large wing. And that's at the Federal Building's main entrance. And there's a poem below it, which you can see here. And it says, "I want to be free, want to be free, rainbow round my shoulder, wings on my feet," written by an anonymous African poet. And then here is a close-up of another view of Africa Rising, which actually goes beyond what I said about the Italian futurists, because it's not entirely abstracted. You can see a human face and a human figure there. And what's interesting about this is it is Barbara Chase Rabu's first explicitly political work of art. And she generally does not put figures into her sculptures. She might have hinted at things like women's hair and so forth, but she's never actually done, or at least not in, her adult career, she has not done figures. So this is pretty interesting. It also looks like the 2nd century statue called Ring Samothrace, which is a headless sculpture that shows basically a winged victory. And then, of course, when you look at this closely, it's not about a Greek sculpture at all, because upon it has, this figure. And if you've taken my African art class, you know what a West African Akan stool looks like, and it looks as though she's actually standing on a West African stool, so that's pretty cool. Okay, and I'm going to move along a little bit. I hope that you read these on your own, of course, but I want to talk a little bit about an artist who might be a little reminiscent of Barbara Chase Rabu, but because she uses abstract sculpture, but she does a lot of really interesting things in that she uses copper and other metals, and she uses the clarity of form of African statuary and also the quality of abstract expressionist gesture that you see in works of artists who are interested in expressing emotional content. So she's important to know. And a lot of her works actually remind me so very much of West African sculpture. This reminds me of something you might see for a fawn altarpiece, for example. This is called Ancestral Parade, and indeed this is the sort of thing you might see on an ancestor's altar that has, it looks like, you know, figures, maybe a horse, maybe an elephant, maybe a dog, maybe a cat. You know, it's abstracted, so it's kind of left up to the viewer, a figure, and another figure walking. But in any case, it's really interesting, and it makes you want to pick those figures out of the abstraction. And this work here too, even though it seems non-representational, it reminds us a lot of a number of things that go back to Africa. It reminds us of that abstraction, might remind us of masks, might remind us of body scarification. Okay, and then here we have another, this is a quilter and a photographer who she too is giving tribute to the Hottentot Venus. And what's interesting is here now, if you know anything about Victorian fashion, which I'm not guessing that you do, but in the Victorian era, women wore dresses that had a bustle built into them, like almost oh, it was like a metal framework that they would put under their clothing on top of their butts to give them a bustle like that. So then we have a woman like Saartjie Baartman, whose body kind of does that naturally. And so again, it's here she's subverting this silhouette, you know, the big butt silhouette, into a tribute to late 19th century women's fashions, but also to Saartjie Baartman. And I'm going to move. Oh yeah, I like this artist. This is Vicki Meek. She's from Dallas, and she does some really interesting work. She's basically looking at the radical art of the Black Power era and the flexibility and dynamics of conceptual media. And she also uses schools and community centers to exhibit her work, and also she puts in audio and visual components. So you might say, oh, also texture, natural fiber, fabric. So you might say she's trying to appeal almost to all 5 of the senses, that you can go into an environment, an installation, if you will, that she has created, and have a full sensory experience. And so she uses things like pop imagery, hand renderings, texts, and symbols, such as this, that have both American and African origin, to rage against injustice. So here we have the Yoruba symbol for the number 16, that stands for comprehensive intelligence. And she believes that using African pictograms in her imagery impresses upon audiences the prolific nature of African heritage. And she's also looking at targeting the urban African American audience because she believes they need to see these images the most. And so here is an environment that she has created, an installation. And the full name of this, it's not a single body of work. You're meant to walk into the gallery and experience the whole thing in full. So this is called A Man in Touch with His Origins. Is a man who never dies, and an homage to Lady Day. And so it's looking at Black cultural history and Black on Black crime. And then she's also using, you can see there's a lot of interesting symbols that she's put into the work. So she's using Yoruba symbols for murder and sorrow. And then she also writes in English things like strong women are really hurt, or I could be angry all the time if I think too hard. And these things are painted onto fabric banners, sometimes sheets of black paper, sometimes plexiglass, or right onto the wall of the gallery. And then they're translated sometimes into Yoruba. And the title phrase, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but you can read it for yourself. So here you can see where she's also taken a quote from Billie Holiday. You can walk into what is almost like a mini room and experience that whole thing there. So Meek kind of is describing in this slide what her process is, how she goes into a room every time she is installing one of these pieces and figures out how she can best say what she needs to say in the space provided. And so what's interesting is what that means is from place to place, she may need to make little changes and little adjustments here and there. And then Carrie Mae Weems, another photographer, very important photographer. She has a BFA from the California Institute of the Arts, and she also has graduate degrees in photography and African American folklore. So she is a photographer and a multimedia and installation artist. So she was first known most as a photographer, but she likes to look at storytelling and she wants to bring that into all of her visual arts projects. So she's looking at things like ethnic, cultural, and sexual identity. So here we have, when you look at this photograph, it doesn't exist by itself. When you look at this photograph, there's a whole story there, and it's open to interpretation what you see. There's a woman in front of a mirror. She's probably putting on makeup. There's a man leaning over her. There's a bottle of liquor. There's cigarettes. They both have glasses. What's happening? Is he just coming in or is he leaving? It makes you want to know what the story behind the photograph is. And so she likes the idea of what's known as a palimpsest. So a palimpsest is essentially, the original meaning of it is a book that has another text written on top of it. And so the underlying text might be covered up or unseen. So what she does, she feels it's a slow and painstaking peeling away of layers of signification to allow for multiple interpretations, as we saw in the last photograph there. So she does all kinds of things. So this is from her Hampton project, which was actually about Hampton University, and that was installed at the Williams College Museum of Art. And basically, she took more than 24 carefully chosen documentary photographs that provided both literal and figurative layers of meaning. And she digitally enlarged them and then printed a lot of them on fabric. And there was a presidential journalist, Francis B. Johnston, who was commissioned in 1900 to document campus life at Virginia's Hampton University. So they are known as the Hampton Album. So what Weems did is she went in and looked at the Native American and African American Hampton students and pulled specifically their photographs from that whole archive. And then she added modern photos of race riots and police brutality, and she reprinted those onto oversized gossamer muslin and canvas screens, which you can see better here, hanging from floor to ceiling. And it's basically going on the false notion that the camera never lies. The idea that you can, a camera might tell a momentary truth, but then it's manipulated. People can manipulate negatives. People can manipulate creative decisions like this, the lighting, the cropping, the vantage point, and so forth. So it's more accurate to assume that the camera always lies or tells only part of the truth. So a little bit more on Kehinde Wiley, who I talked about in the beginning. He was born in 1977. To me, he's still a young pup. But in any case, you can see here how it's talking a little bit about his process, which I talked about earlier. He's one of my favorite artists. And so he, as I said, started out by hanging out in his studio and looking for young men in hip-hop culture. He would call them into the studio and ask them to look at photographs he had, or prints of various art historical paintings, and then he would pose them dressed exactly as they were into the form of these paintings. So this is from a very classical art historical painting called The Three Graces, which usually is three nude women. Now we have three black young men. And in the background of all his pieces are what he calls floration. You can see they all have really elaborate backgrounds. And it's basically things, design elements from the Baroque age to the Rococo age, sometimes Islamic. And it just kind of takes away maybe from the machismo of his subject, because he's also looking at questions of African American male sexuality. And initially, when he first started doing portraits or doing these pieces, he only did men. He has started portraying women since then. And of course, you may know he most recently is most famous for creating the official portrait of Barack Obama. So Glenn Ligon is an American conceptual artist, and conceptual art, this is on your vocabulary list, but I'm going to redefine it here. Conceptual art is art in which the concept is more important than whether the work is rendered well or beautifully or that kind of thing. If you can get the concept, that's the most important thing. So for Glenn Ligon, he's about race, language, desire, sexuality, and identity. And he engages in intertextuality with other works from the visual arts, literature, history, and his own life. And he identifies as gay. So a lot of his work is about those things. And this is actually an installation that he did. And one might say it's site specific. You have installation, and then you have site specific installation where it's installed is really important. Like, it could not be seen almost anywhere else. And this was done inside what looks like a jail cell. So it really could not be anywhere else. And he does a lot of word art here, where he takes elusive phrases and he stencils them in black letters on a gesso primed white canvas. And the letters make words and the words make phrases, and then they kind of blur into one another. And he uses oil sticks, so he, as he's working, he might go back and accidentally smudge it, but he doesn't worry about it. He just kind of keeps going, working downwards, and then the words become barely legible, and the meaning sort of fades into the background. So, and other things that he likes to do is include writings from people like James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, and Gertrude Stein. Yeah. All right, so Odili Donald Odida was born in Enugu, Nigeria. He lives and works in Philadelphia and New York, and we're going to look at his work next. He is a painter. And he has used very precise form and color, as you can see here. And he's kind of relocating abstraction in the realm of the personal and the discursive, as a lot of African American artists do. He believes that all visual materials are culturally grounded, and it's important to recognize where their meanings are derived from. So his work is inspired by West African textile patterns and geometric abstraction, and he uses both of these things to create rhythm and pattern in his work, as you can see. Let me see, I'm going to kind of move. Oh, yeah, I do want to talk about this guy. His work just knocks me out. So Whitfield Lovell, he basically does very beautiful drawings, and he puts them in a more modern sort of feeling. So he creates drawings in pencil, oil stick, or charcoal, sometimes works directly on walls, but then he also does them on found objects that he collects when he goes to flea markets and antique shops. So here is an interesting piece that's on a circle of wood with, well, boxing gloves or maybe even baseball gloves, which have, the connotation of sports and so forth. And so it's interesting in that he's exquisitely rendered people's faces in beautiful detail, beautiful drawings that, remind us of earlier artists from the 18th century. And it's almost like he's bringing these people back from the past to claim the recognition that they're due. As you can, yeah, that's another one there. And he's not trying to be sentimental about it either. It's much more postmodern. So, trying to look at the politically charged indictments of social injustice. So this is called Patience from 2004. It's life size, so it's hard to see that in the slide, but imagine that. So it's a beautiful young woman, and she is, you might notice, she's wearing one of those 19th century bustles on the back of her dress. And then there's an old style radio in front of her on the floor. And so there's this kind of combination of youth and outmoded technology here that produces a vanitas reference to fleeting time. And so vanitas is a style of artwork that goes back to the Renaissance, actually, which is vanitas were paintings that artists did usually of things like rotting flowers, rotting fruit, sometimes skeletons, to remind us that we're mortal and we are not going to be here forever. So it's, as it says here, he's trying to remind the contemporary audience that, we're not going to be here forever, and it does it more effectively than the conventional rotting fruit and drooping flowers. Yeah, and here, even more brutal, you've got a rifle going right into the image there, and it's heartbreaking in a lot of ways. Again, making a statement about gun violence. So Layla Ali, not to be confused with the children of Muhammad Ali, she is not. She's a contemporary visual artist, and she does some really interesting work in which she does not necessarily give her beings in her picture race as we know it. So these are not her green heads. These are, well, one guy's headless. She is kind of a pink head. Let's look at her green heads, she calls them. These are what she is known for. These strange beings that are meant to be gender neutral, and they're of indeterminate age, gender, race, or meaning. So when she gives you an image like it's open to interpretation what's going on there and who's doing what to whom. Or this here, like, what is this about? What is she saying? And she's minimalist in a way, in that she's reduced her figures to their most minimal amount of information that you need to know what they are. And, again, removing their skin color and so forth. So it's meant to show that there are, as she says herself, uncomfortable undertones of mistrust and conflict that often characterize social experience. Like, you may have one face that you're actually showing, but on the inside, maybe it's the same, maybe it lines up, maybe it doesn't. And then later on, she does these black and white typology drawings, which I just love, love, love these. And she's kind of documenting, as it says, an imaginary anthropology. And again, it kind of defies any kind of categorization based on race. Mickalene Thomas, another famous contemporary artist that I really love. She's an African-American feminist, socio-political artist, and filmmaker. And she's known for putting lots and lots of rhinestones and enamel and very colorful paint into her pieces. And she's known for, she's actually appeared in, I think, a Jay-Z video. and she draws from art history and pop culture. And yeah, there she is with Jay-Z. So that's in his popular song, Picasso Baby, and the accompanying performance art film, Jay-Z considers the exchange of energy between an artist and his audience, a cultural tete-a-tete of sorts, then shouts, "I'm the modern day Pablo." So missing, you'll blink it, she's in there. There she is. And so she does images that look like this. This one doesn't seem to have any of her usual sparkles and things, but the women are very powerful. They're very large. They radiate female sexuality. And you can see, here's one. This one actually has lots of really beautiful rhinestones, and sometimes she puts actual jewelry into them, and the woman's hair, and it's 60 by 48 inches, so it's 5 feet by 4 feet, so it's really, really big. And this one here, une très belle négresse, very beautiful woman, very beautiful black woman. Wengechi Mutu, I'm going to talk more about her when I talk about futurism, but or Afrofuturism, but I'm going to talk about her here for a moment. She was born in Nairobi, Kenya, and although she's African, she really now, in a lot of ways, has become very American because she lives and works in New York City and has for many, many years, and she's probably one of the most important African artists working today. And she uses all kinds of things, but she's best known for her very large-scale collages on pieces of mylar. And mylar is like that very, I don't know, slippery kind of paper. And she makes a lot of statements about the female body, and she entwines them, as it says, with plant-like or animal-like elements and intertwined with abstract patterns that merge the organic and the surreal with human forms. And these hybrid creatures have bodies made of a combination of machine, animal, human, and monster parts. And she constructs them out of all kinds of things. And as she says, females carry the marks, language, and nuances of their culture more than the male. Anything that is desired or despised is always placed on the female body. So yeah, and they're just fantastic and outlandish, as you can see. And she also, she herself has had some, you might call them female issues, where she's had to have surgery and so forth. So she's done some pieces that a little bit hard to look at and consider because they feature things happening on the female body. But we'll get into that a little bit later, because now we're going to talk about this gentleman, Titus Kaphar, who was born in 1976 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he too, like a lot of these artists, uses lots of mediums. He's also looking at the work of classic and Renaissance painters using the techniques that they used, but he also does it with a very, very contemporary eye. So here he was very impacted by the Ferguson protests. So this is a 4 foot by 5 foot tall oil painting called Yet Another Fight for Remembrance. And basically he was looking at the photographs of the Ferguson protests and rendering them exquisitely. Actually, these are exquisitely painted. They're not the photographs, with great detail, but then going back in and literally whiting them out with white paint. So it's kind of making a statement about what is happening in Ferguson and what was happening in the country and is happening in the country. And a lot of what he does, as it says in the slide, is he researches criminal justice as it's happening in this country. And what he wants to do is to document people who are taken away too soon and to challenge people not to forget these young people. And here we'll see another, oh, well, you can see this. I'm not quite getting to the next one, but this is chalk and asphalt diptych. So both hands are black and written in white paint. At the bottom right are the numbers 68 and 14. And basically showing crowded scenes of black figures with hands raised and open against the night sky, taken from different protests and different riots and so forth. All right. I'm gonna do, so here we have juxtaposed, again, very beautifully, very exquisitely rendered, one face over the other of, four young men who were killed through police violence. And then these are the ones that I was anticipating getting to. So these are incredible. His father had been imprisoned, and in 2011, he wanted to look for his father's prison records. And he found dozens of men, essentially, who shared his father's first name, Jerome, and his same last name. And so he basically took the photographs of these men and rendered them exquisitely beautiful on gold leaf background. If you remember when I was talking about Barclay Hendricks doing the same thing, exquisite gold leaf background, exquisite painting style, Renaissance painting style, and then covering up the bottom part with black tar. And it's basically saying, being imprisoned is not the entirety of a person's identity, and that each work is about an individual person, but it represents a community of people who are being overrepresented in the prison population. So, yeah, this explains it a little bit more in depth, and I encourage you to read about it more in depth. I just wanted to call it to your attention with this little slideshow or with my little video here. So finally, in this last bit, we're going to talk about outsider art, and it's a term that was coined by Roger Cardinal in 1975, as it says here, and it basically helps the art world understand and therefore include a lot of fine artists that might not have been considered legitimate artists. In the past, we've used the term folk artist or primitive artist. So outsider art is meant to be more inclusive. So self-taught is maybe a broader and more encompassing expression that includes artists who are living mainstream lives, but they weren't trained as artists. So as it says in the slide, great artists produce great art, whether they're trained or simply have a natural gift for expressing themselves through the outlet of their art. And, somebody like Horace Pippin would have been considered an outsider artist. And that, of course, did not keep him from becoming one of the world's best known artists. So we're going to look at two. There are many, many more, but we're going to look at two. The first is Purvis Young. He was an American artist from the Overtown neighborhood of Miami, Florida. And what's interesting about Purvis is he was not, again, trained as an artist. He actually was imprisoned for breaking and entering. And he was only 19 at the time. And he says that an angel came to him and told him to paint. And that's the way it is with a lot of these outsider artists. They have visions or something like that from God, and they tell them that they have to paint. So he watched and read a lot of documentaries. He looks at art books, also history and spiritual folklore. And as we'll see in the slides, he's got a lot of what we would call a visual vocabulary of self-portraits of different figures, holy men, angels, boats, horses, erotica, trains. He often uses people and angels with halos, like you see here. This was actually painted on a door. It's huge, it's heavy, like a lot of his work. He would paint on anything. He never stopped painting. He's just one of those people that was remarkably prolific. They had warehouses full of his art when he died. It's incredible. And so, he says, I painted a lot of angels. God sends angels to clear up some of this trouble on earth. And then he likes to paint horses. These are like horses roaming through the city. And he sees them as figures of freedom. And locks. So this is a truck, which is a type of transportation, but there's locks on it. And he sees that as about being locked up in prison. And then Thornton Dial is another one of these self-taught artists. And his work is really interesting in that when you stare at it, it kind of takes your breath away. He just puts lots and lots of things together. They're what is called an assemblage, which means lots and lots of pieces put together to make one piece. So here he is in his studio. And he says that if there's one thing you can do, leave something for someone else. You can work for somebody else's freedom. You can leave something for somebody else's child. This is life. And so, as you can see, there's this huge collection of objects. And then generally, no, they tend to be really, well, let's go back to the last slide. Oh, it's just like being in class with me, isn't it? Okay, here we go. Current slide, please. Oh, seriously? No. All right, I'm just going to stop. I hope you look at it on your own. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you all soon. Thanks.